Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Vicky Oelze. She is an associate professor in the Anthropology Department and Director of the Primate Ecology and Molecular Anthropology Lab at the University of California, Santa Cruz. And today we're going to talk mostly about the evolution of the human diet, or of human diets in the plural. So Vicky, welcome to the show. It's a huge pleasure to everyone.
Yeah, thank you, Ricardo, for inviting me. I'm very excited, and I'm very curious if I can answer like the many questions that you have. I saw that you want to dive into deep time with me, so let's go.
Yeah, sure. So let's start with this. How can we study human diets through archaeological and fossil remains? I mean, what do we look at and what kinds of evidence can we find in the fossil remains?
Right. So like what kind of methods we can actually like employ, right? So
Yes.
Let me like kind of clarify what we're talking about. So like if we're talking about the evolution of the human diet, right? We're like much more like temporarily constrained. If we think about that, we're thinking that our own species, Homo sapiens, probably evolved earlier than 300,000 years ago. Right. But a lot of people that are studying actually the evolution of the human diet go much, much further back into time. Right. So we're actually like looking further into our more ancestral lineage of our species. Right. Like looking into early Homo and all the other hominin species that we know of in South and East Africa that are, our cousins and sister taxons in early human evolution. And so the spectrum of methods that we as biological anthropologists use is actually like it's actually a pretty big toolkit, and increasingly scholars are using many different lines of evidence about the dietary adaptations of fossil hominins or early humans to kind of like have a bigger picture, right? And so one of the methods that allows us actually to go pretty deep into time is the one that I'm specialist in, which is isotope analysis. And so I'm happy to talk about that much more. But just to give you a little bit more of a framework, there are many other methods that we actually look at. So before isotopes were kind of like on the table as a biomolecular tool to look into diet, we mainly were looking at the morphology of these early fossil hominins, looking particularly at their mastication apparatus and their teeth, right? Because the size and shape, so the morphology of the teeth actually say a lot about what a given critter is evolved to consume. And along with like just like the morphology of the teeth, but also like the whole mastication apparatus, another way of looking into the dietary adaptations of creatures is to actually look at dental wear, right? So if we are using our teeth as animals to process foods, right? Like, so our teeth are actually this incredible interface that we have between the environment, that the ecosystem that provides the food resources, and our own body, right? Like that first point of contact is actually the dentition. And so the teeth often leave a lot of very, very interesting traces of what has been chewed in the terms of scratch marks and pits that form through the consumption of maybe soft foods, but particularly through hard and tough and abrasive foods. So then besides these two lines of evidence, so also in the microware world, there has been a lot of like incredible work over the last like decade or two in terms of really going into like the micro surface texture that is associated with eating different kinds of foods. What I'm specialized in, as I already said, is isotopes. And in deep time, we also work with teeth. So when we are actually looking at the biomolecular biochemical signal that we find in, for example, early fossil hominins, or also later in Homo sapiens, in our sister taxons, like for example, Neanderthals. We often refer to tiny little pieces of the tooth enamel and measure the isotope ratio of specific elements that are very abundant in our food and indicate something of the nature of the food that was eaten. And we rely on teeth, not because the teeth are having that interaction with the food items themselves, but because the teeth are incorporating all the elements that we actually consume through food and also through water, and they become deposited in our tooth or teeth, where they mineralize and will remain locked for eternity, which is really incredible. And so that allows us actually to go very deep into time. For example, some of the very early hominins that have been analyzed for isotopes include, Ardipithecus ramidus, 4.2, 4.4 million years, somewhere around there, where we can actually measure the biochemical signal in the tooth enamel and say something about what categories of food these early hominins were consuming. In this case, the question was, are they living in an environment and consuming resources in an environment that's more forest-like, more like a closed canopy, more moist environment, or is it out in the open, more dry savanna landscape of East Africa? And so isotopes are a really, really important tool that has been used later or in more recent time epochs. We can also, move away from just being able to work with teeth. We can actually work with bones, particularly by extracting the proteins out of the bones. So the bones and the proteins in our bones are really derived from the proteins that we consume through food, right? And so there's this direct relationship here. And so a lot of work, for example, on Neanderthals, but also early modern humans, is then done in bone collagen, where we look at the carbon and nitrogen stable isotope ratios specifically to get an idea about the position of these species in their food web, right? Are they herbivores? Are they omnivores, or are they true carnivores, as we know now for a long time, for example, for a lot of groups of Neanderthals, that they were really top predator carnivores that also eat plants, but really were incredible hunters and meat eaters.
So I have 2 or 3 follow-up questions to all of that. So the first one is, how detailed of a picture can we get about a specific hominin's diet? I mean, can we pinpoint specific kinds of foods, or can we only learn about some of the more general categories of foods that it ate, or perhaps if it was harder or softer food, or if it was more plant-based or meat-based? I mean, how much can we extract in terms of information from fossils about diet?
Yeah, that's exactly the big question that we've been working on as a scientific community for decades, to actually bring more tools into the toolkit to get more and more precise with our estimation and evaluation of past diets, because each method is actually very limited in what we can say. So, and you're really touching on this. We cannot say this species was eating this fruit or this specific herb, or they were eating this specific kind of mammal, right? But what we can say, for example, using isotope ratios, is often how much of the diet was composed of vegetation and how much was composed of, for example, the meat or other tissues of herbivorous animals, right? So this, particularly with isotopes, it's really linked, or our understanding of how we use the method is really want to understand how much they're actually consuming meat versus vegetation, right? Because like in early human evolution, we have like this big debate about, man the hunter or man the hunted, right? That kind of like only resolves like around the time of Homo erectus, where I think everybody has this consensus that we understand that they were indeed hunting, possibly also still scavenging opportunistically, but that they were very well able to hunt larger game. In the earlier hominin record, it is much more tricky. So in early Homo or Homo habilis, it's not as clear how much these guys are actually eating meat. But we would like to know, because the whole hypothesis about the really incredible investment into brain growth, right, and having like in our lineage, this trajectory towards getting like bigger and bigger brains and becoming smarter and smarter. The main hypothesis for the longest time has been that this was driven by consumption of meat. And then some people like made it a little bit more specific. It's not actually the meat, it's also it's just like high caloric animal resources, namely, for example, fat. Right? If we think about like brain tissue is incredibly nutritious, that's not necessarily meat, or also bone marrow being incredibly rich in fats, for example, and we don't consider that meat, right? And the cool thing is like that we have this limitation in each method, but sometimes these methods then have a little bit of a complementary information. So, for example, as you already said, like for example, the dental wear analysis doesn't say something about like if meat or if plants were consumed, but is provides a lot of information if hard foods or tough foods were consumed, right? And so if you put like different lines of evidence together, we have like this emerging picture if a certain diet was more likely. For example, if a specific specimen of early hominin was maybe eating a little bit of meat, or was, as we see in like some specimens, they probably like seasonally eating like incredibly hard food resources, where you can think about like what can that be? What kind of seed pod or nut is that hard that it would leave these like indentations on it in the teeth? So here I would really like to also emphasize that method development is ongoing in this field of research, right? All these different methods, they're getting like more and more nuanced and fine-grained in getting to the nature of food resources that we can identify in the fossil record. Namely, in the isotope world, we just recently had a gigantic breakthrough methodologically by finally being able to measure nitrogen isotopes in tooth enamel. So up to very recently, up to like a few years ago, we were limited to measure carbon isotopes in tooth enamel of fossils and oxygen isotopes. Well, carbon isotopes actually in the archaeological record and the fossil record basically only tell you something about a critter being out foraging in an open savanna landscape, that it's dominated by specific type of grasses that has a different photosynthetic pathway. We call them C4 grasses, and they have a very distinct carbon isotope signature compared to all the other plants on planet Earth that have a C3 photosynthetic pathway. And those plants, for example, particularly in the African context, are more limited to more denser woodlands and forest environments. So far, carbon isotopes could only, in combination with oxygen, tell us something about if a hominin was thriving out in the savanna woodland, or if they were living in a forest, which again is, gives you an idea of what environment they utilize, which is valuable and very important, but it doesn't really get to this question like, well, what are they actually eating? So since very recently, some colleagues are able to measure nitrogen isotopes in tooth enamel. And that was a gigantic breakthrough because there's actually incredibly tiny amounts of nitrogen that are found in tooth enamel. So nitrogen is an element that is associated with proteins in the body, and you maybe can imagine that in our white tooth enamel, the tooth crown, there's very little protein in there, right? That stuff doesn't really need to be flexible or be able to bend to pressures. We want this stuff to be as hard as possible. So tooth enamel is actually the hardest material that we have in the body, right?
Yeah.
Which is why we can use it in such deep time context, which is awesome. However, nitrogen is actually the isotope that has the biggest differentiation between trophic levels. So in nitrogen, we can really see if an animal is an herbivore or a carnivore, or if it's like an animal that's like somewhere intermediate, utilizing both plant and animal resources in the diet. And so it was really frustrating that given there's such tiny amounts of nitrogen in enamel, it was kind of impossible for us to measure these tiny amounts. And actually, like when I started working with isotopes as a student, it was never even mentioned, really, right? Like in the chemical formula of hydroxyapatite, which makes tooth enamel, there's no nitrogen in there. So we never really talked about these tiny quantities of nitrogen that are actually embedded in the mineral matrix of the tooth enamel. And so a really cool new method that was, as far as I understand, developed at the University of Princeton and is now applied very widely by my colleague Tina Lüdecke at the Max Planck Institute for Chemistry. They are utilizing this new method where they hand over a tiny amount of tooth enamel to bacteria that target these tiny amounts of the nitrogen in the tooth enamel. They eat it up, and then they literally fart out whatever they ate. And then you can actually collect that, kill the bacteria and then collect the gas that they were producing. And that's enough then to actually hand it over to a mass spectrometer and measure it. And so Tina's team at the Max Planck Max Planck Institute for Chemistry, they are now starting to work on all of these fossil hominins that we have been speculating about for decades now, what their dietary adaptation actually looked like, with contradictory evidence coming from carbon isotopes or from dental wear or from morphology, and also like from the entire environmental context. And they're now producing actually data for some of these fossil hominins. And from there, you can see that it looks like some of these species were largely herbivores. They're mainly determined, like their main dietary everyday adaptation was consuming plant materials. And then occasionally they also were consuming meat. And so like that is kind of like there will be a lot of very, very incredible new papers published by this lab over the next few years as they like move through analyzing all these specimens from the archaeological record in East and South Africa. And this is also where my work on extant chimpanzees actually comes in, because like over the last decade or so, or maybe 15 years by now, I've been like trying to demonstrate how these isotopes that we use to measure in the archaeological and fossil record how they actually look like in chimpanzees today, right? And chimpanzees being like one of the animals out there that we use as a reference model for early human evolution, because there's so many things that are intriguing about chimpanzees, not just their ecology, but also like their comparable body size. They are very, very social primate. They're tool users, right? They're very sophisticated creatures that have culture. And so we're kind of like leaning very much on, and chimpanzees, they're not a perfect model, but they're a very useful model. And I've been working a lot on kind of developing an isotopic framework. Well, how do these isotopes actually look like in chimpanzees where we know what they're eating, we know how much meat they're eating, and how useful are these biochemical tools actually in detecting these low rates of meat consumption. And my work has been a little bit critical about how useful these isotopes actually are in this context, and I'm like happy to talk about that a little bit more.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, I'm also going to ask you about other great apes, particularly the closest to us, that would be chimpanzees and bonobos. But let me ask you also, in regards to dentition, can we get information from teeth by just simply by looking at the types of dentition that a particular hominin species has? And I mean, looking at the different types of teeth, the incisors, the canines, the premolars and the molars, and perhaps the number of each type of teeth they have, and perhaps dental anatomy as well. Can we just get information just from that?
Generally speaking, yes, but like the primates, the primate order actually has a very generalized dentition.
Okay.
Our teeth are so we have the same number of teeth, right? Like we share the same number of teeth with all great apes and with other primates that are around on planet Earth today. And we also have the same number and typology of teeth that we share with our fossil hominin ancestors, right? And generally, like our dentition is quite generalized. Our teeth are good for pretty much everything and nothing, right? But it's true that particularly tooth size can be linked to how much we actually invested into chewing, right? Mastication. And so we have like some candidate species, for example, Paranthropus boisei, that many of your listeners may have heard about as Nutcracker Man, a taxon of hominins that we find in East Africa. And they have these gigantic mastication apparatus, these gigantic jaws and like really, really big teeth, including like very, very big molars. And so they are really like teeth that look like they're like able to chomp down and grind down like really either tough or very hard matter. And then here we really think that they're more consuming vegetation, right? Mm-hmm. And then the big question is like, what kind of vegetation? And how can eating a relatively poor vegetation matter that's very tough, such as grasses, how on earth can that fuel the relatively large brain that we find in this hominin species, right? So like Paranthropus boisei, there is like a plethora of incredible papers out there that are like showing like the contradiction of brain size and mastication in this particular species. But generalized dentition means that our teeth are not showing any evidence for being specialized, for example, as you would see in a carnivore, to capture prey and bring down prey, right? Like, so we don't have teeth that suggest that we're carnivores in none of the fossil hominins, right? So we don't, for a long time, we already have not these gigantic canines that you, for example, still see in chimpanzees. And chimpanzees probably also don't have them for in association with diet, right? Chimpanzees still have, like, particularly the males, like relatively large canines that are quite impressive and can do quite some harm. But they don't have them because of the fact that they occasionally hunt and bring down prey. They have it for male-male competition. They basically just have it so they can, beat each other up better, right? And which makes sense because like females have like they still have like larger canines than we do, but females have smaller canines than males do, which suggests that it's not a dietary a relationship to diet, but it is more related to sexual competition. So that said, the number of teeth is the same across all of us. Nutcracker men, chimpanzees, us, Neanderthals, we all have pretty much the same, a very, very similar dentition, which is why actually looking into the dental wear and isotope ratios is a more useful proxy to help us solve this puzzle.
So earlier you mentioned chimpanzees. Is there any other great ape species that you also study?
Yeah, so I'm actually like very, very lucky to be one of the people who studies all African great apes using isotopes. So I started working on bonobos. And here really the question was, how does the isotopic profile of our closest cousin, right, chimpanzees and bonobos being our closest living relatives on planet Earth today? And so the question really was, how does the isotopic profile for carbon and nitrogen isotopes of this incredible ape species that's endemic to the forest of the Congo, south of the Congo River, how does it look like? Because just a few years before that, my colleagues actually made the first observations that bonobos regularly hunt for primate prey. There was like before that some anecdotal information that bonobos were occasionally, capturing like some smaller animal. There's like some early papers where researchers describe bonobos capturing like a little tree squirrel or something like that, and then basically playing it to death. And then when the animal is dead, I might as well eat it, right? But my colleagues from the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, specifically at the site of Leukotal, they really made observations that these bonobos are not just occasionally using the opportunity to grab a duiker, which is a small forest antelope that often just like hunkers down. And so you can imagine it's actually easy to actually capture, relatively speaking. But they were actually like going up in the trees and hunting for monkeys, right? And so like that kind of like changed our entire perception of bonobos, right? The species that we normally refer to as make love, not war. They're always chill. They're never showing aggression in any kind, right? Like, no, they actually do hunt actively, and they kill other primates. And then more recently, we actually know that the rates of male-male aggression in bonobos is actually even higher than what we see in chimpanzees. There was a really fascinating paper that came out last year or so, or maybe 2 years ago by now. But so I first started working on bonobos just to see if using the stable isotope approach, measuring hair samples from sleeping nests of these animals, do we detect these low amounts, but reoccurring meat-eating events, these low amounts of meat eating, do we detect that in their isotope profiles that we have in hair? And that was my first project on great apes. I was still a PhD student by then, working on archaeological research questions. And I had to say no. We actually do not see any spikes in their nitrogen isotope ratios after they had like a phase where they were doing a lot of hunting. Or we had like a very, very interesting phase that we could capture in that study where for about a week, there was a caterpillar boom in the forest. So there's apparently like, I don't know we don't even know if it's like one or several species of butterflies that are just reproducing over, they're not seen for years. And then you have like this one season where the whole forest is just raining down with these gigantic caterpillars. And the bonobos were having a feast, they were eating pounds and pounds of these caterpillars every day. And I measured the nitrogen isotope ratios of these caterpillars, and you could see that, they are eating vegetation. So they are looking like a typical herbivore. So they actually have a similar isotope signature as an antelope, a forest antelope would. And so the prediction was then, well, if they're eating these caterpillars for a full week, we should see a meat-eating response, right? Like the nitrogen isotope values of the bonobos eating them would spike in that time period. But it didn't. What we did see, however, was that adolescent males that are relatively low ranking in bonobo society, right? Bonobos are living in a matriarchy, so females having a very, very strong bonds with each other that allow them to actually rule the community. And so adolescent and upcoming males are relatively low in their social dominance rank in the community. And we could see that, yes, indeed, their nitrogen isotope profiles were much lower than everybody else's, kind of supporting the observation that they often get kind of like left out of any meat-eating opportunities. So that was like kind of the only indicator that we have that maybe nitrogen isotopes can, to some degree, track the presence or absence of meat in a great apes diet. But it was kind of like inconclusive. I then moved on to another really awesome opportunity to do an isotopic study on lowland gorillas from Gabon, so Western lowland gorillas that are coexisting, so living in sympatry with chimpanzees in a field site at the Atlantic coast of Gabon, an incredible place called Loango. And here the question was a very, very different one. It was not really related to meat consumption, but we just wanted to see how much these gorillas and chimpanzees that utilize a similar environment, that overlap with each other dietarily, how much they actually overlap, and if there's maybe a seasonal difference in how much they overlap in their diet. Because this kind of conflict, or the question is there like resource competition between gorillas and chimpanzees, was like something that I thought was very, very interesting, because we always think that gorillas, they just eat like terrestrial herbaceous vegetation, they just sit around on the ground and just eat leaves. And that's absolutely not true. Particularly lowland gorillas actually eat a lot of ripe fruit. And from previous work, we knew that the gorillas in Loango, they kind of like have a different feeding preference. So they like slightly different fruit than chimpanzees, but there are a lot of species of fruit that both chimpanzees and gorillas actually really like. And so you can imagine that there's a conflict potential, right? Like if these two species compete over the same resource. And so looking actually at the isotope ratios in the hair of chimpanzees and gorillas from Loango, we could see that they have a lot of like niche partitioning. So they're like, their dietary profiles are separate, with the gorillas eating indeed much more terrestrial herbaceous vegetation, and the chimpanzees really being much, much more specialized in ripe fruit. But there was also a lot of overlap, particularly seasonally. There's like a couple of fruit species that they both like. And that might be like kind of like boring to kind of look into the specifics of that. But just a couple of years ago, there was actually the first observation ever made of the chimpanzees at Loango actually killing a lowland gorilla is at this specific field site, right? which was, as far as I know, like was kind of like an open question. Like, what do chimpanzees and gorillas do when they bump into each other in the wild, right? And so we can assume that like if groups bump into each other, right, particularly gorillas having like these enormous silverback males that are very capable in defending their community and their family, that they would probably like avoid each other, right? Just like we know chimpanzees bumping into elephants, they go like, oh, we'd rather get out of here, right? But in this case, they actually bumped into a single individual. And the chimpanzees, they killed this gorilla, right? And so then the picture kind of works that, showing this level of aggression to another species of great ape in their habitat actually makes a little bit of sense because they have dietary overlap. So they're competing over resources. And so that was kind of like I hope that my colleagues at Loango will not have to witness this again, because I think it was a very horrible thing to actually see and observe. But I think it's really interesting how, again, like the competition over food resources, how that obviously also predicts social behavior, and also social behavior or behavior between species.
So when it comes to comparative biology, in the specific case of diet and the diets of great apes, to what extent can we derive information from studying, for example, chimpanzees and bonobos that would apply to our last common ancestor and perhaps the earlier hominins?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think this is a very, very interesting question. So after like doing this work on, looking at bonobos, then, looking at niche partitioning between gorillas and chimpanzees, I actually started looking into like a lot of other like also chimpanzee populations across Africa. And so here I think chimpanzees are a particular useful model in terms of using this method, isotope analysis, because chimpanzees have adapted to a vast range of environmental conditions throughout the African continent, right? When we have chimpanzees that are living in primary evergreen rainforests, for example, we have some incredible study populations in West Africa that are living in these ancient forests. They never see a grassland, right? And the food resources that they can utilize in these ecosystems are completely different from some of the chimpanzee populations out there that live in woodland savanna environments that are very open, very dry, very seasonally incredibly dry, very hot. And so we actually know for a couple of years that we have chimpanzees that are living in absolutely outrageous environments, for example, in the Senegal, where previously people never thought that they could survive out there because it is so dry seasonally and also so hot. And so that makes chimpanzees actually an incredibly useful model for early human evolution. If we're thinking that a lot of the drivers of bipedalism and brain growth and increased sophistication in tool use may have been driven in that environmental shift from our ancestors kind of like moving out of the forests into more open environments of woodland savanna. And here it's very important to also understand that it's not our ancestors leaving their environments and moving somewhere else, but it's the environment that's changing, right? So we have large climatic changes in the Pleistocene that are really like affecting the expansion of grasslands in Africa. So forests are receding. That environment that our earlier ancestors, our common ancestors that we shared with chimpanzees and bonobos, were probably a forest adapted critter. And then the environment is changing, and you can either go with it or you basically go extinct by like sticking to these little pockets of forest, or you might still survive in those pockets, as chimpanzees and bonobos, their ancestors obviously survived by going the route of staying in the forest, right? Whereas like early hominins, like they were probably really thriving and proliferating into different species because of the expansions of these woodland grasslands and the mosaic of like, little gallery forests around rivers. So that a really mix of different habitat types that you can find like emerging in South and in East Africa. And so there are some chimpanzees that you can basically find across equatorial Africa that match all these different environments, which is really amazing. So we have, for example, the Luangwa chimpanzees. They're a great candidate if you're interested in a hominin that lives in a mosaic of environments. So you have patches of open savanna, you have swamps, you have gallery forests. And so that is the environment that the Luangwa chimpanzees live in. We think a lot of our ancestors in East Africa particularly came out of a savanna type that we refer to as Miombo woodland. Those are it's a very particular kind of woodland because it's dominated by a specific kind of trees that actually produce like relatively nutrient poor soils. And so this is kind of like the environment that we think a lot of our ancestors evolved in. So they're like relatively open environments with these miombo trees. So these are woody legumes. And then interspaced by like, gallery forests around like some creeks and rivers, in a relatively hilly landscape. And so we have chimpanzees that live in these kind of environments, like particularly one population of chimpanzees that I had the privilege to study, and I have several ongoing projects, is a field site called Isa Valley in Tanzania. And this is an absolutely stunning field site. Your listeners, if they want to get an idea, they can check it out. It's they can find it under the website called GMERC. I think it is at gmerc.com. So the Isa Valley is these open savanna woodlands interspersed with these beautiful miombo trees that provide seed pods that are, relatively large food resources that chimpanzees love to utilize, interspaced by like these beautiful gallery forests. And these chimpanzees are a very, very useful model actually for fossil hominins because it's a very similar environment. We have a long dry season. We have a relatively short rainy season, so climatically probably also very, very similar, and a similar environment. And the species, like also the species community out there being like relatively comparable to the species community that was around a couple of million years ago. And so we actually have like several projects going on at ISA with isotopes. And so here the big challenging thing is actually that this Miombo environment is producing relatively low nitrogen isotope values because these trees that are dominating this landscape are legumes. And I don't know how much you know about legumes, but legumes are able to actually fixate nitrogen from the air, right? So they're not exclusively, most other plants are just taking it up from the soil with the help of bacteria. Well, these trees, legumes, including, like your beans and your lentils and your peas and your alfalfa, all these plants are actually able to fixate air nitrogen also to the help of bacteria. And so the nitrogen isotope values are very, very low in this environment. And so now that we are actually able to measure nitrogen isotope ratios in fossil hominins, right, through this new method that was developed in Princeton, we need more frameworks from these kind of environments that are pretty messy in terms of the isotope ratios, so produce really weird values. And we need a good contextual framework to understand well, how does meat eating look like in this environment, right?
Mhm.
Where all the nitrogen isotope values are relatively low because of the presence of these woody legumes. Another project that we just started at this field site that I just wanted to mention because I'm beyond excited about this project is we're looking into the role of mushrooms as well. So I don't know, Ricardo, how much you love mushrooms, but like I'm very, very much interested in also foraging for mushrooms here in the beautiful redwood forest of California. And mushrooms are a very important food resource, and we still have no idea if, and if yes, how much fossil hominins and early hominins may have been actually using this incredible food resource, right? Because if we know that early hominins were large-brained, that would suggest that they're relatively smart, right, and have a quite detailed understanding of their environment. We know that chimpanzees have those abilities, right? Like chimpanzees know exactly which trees are fruiting when and where to go, depending on the season. They can have really like mental maps of their territory in terms of where food resources are. And chimpanzees know which mushrooms they can eat and which one they can't. And mushrooms are incredibly high in protein, and also like some of them have very, very important trace minerals in them, right? And so we're actually doing a project now looking at like, well, how do the isotopes actually look like in these mushrooms? Because there's incredible work that has been done on a variety of mushrooms. Mushrooms can look like meat in terms of their isotope ratios. So if we ever determine that we might find a fossil hominin taxon that has really high nitrogen isotope ratios, and the community goes like, oh, we finally found this one hominin that was like eating tons of meat, we might actually want to think about like, well, were they eating a lot of meat? Were they maybe also eating mushrooms, right? That's something that was actually proposed also for Neanderthals, right? Neanderthals in Europe having these really high nitrogen isotope values. And a lot of that we can explain by them hunting mammoths, woolly mammoths, that for whatever reason also has unusual high nitrogen isotope values. So if you eat a critter like that, you will really like your isotope ratios will look like you are a top carnivore. But we also know that Neanderthals were utilizing a ton of plant resources year round, right? And so my question is still like, well, what about them mushrooms, right? And I find it very interesting because, like, at least here in Santa Cruz, like mushrooms are very, very much beloved by the local community. They're very much an up and coming food resource here. And I really like the idea that we're finally like, getting at that question of mushrooms in the diet of chimpanzees.
Great. So let me ask you now, what do we know about the human diet during the Paleolithic?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I was kind of like a little bit touching on that, right? So if you're thinking about like moving out of Africa, do you want to stay in Africa? Are we moving out of Africa into like the more interesting questions of what's happening during the Paleolithic in Europe, where we have like all these different hominins running around, like Homo sapiens being around, and Neanderthals being around, and Denisovans being around. Yeah. So just to make clear, I'm not a Paleolithic archaeologist, right? So I personally have never done any work on Paleolithic hominins. But my PhD advisor, Mike Richards, for example, did a lot of work on the dietary ecology of Neanderthals using stable isotope analysis. And he was studying like a lot of fossil hominins, Neanderthals, from various sites in Europe and Eurasia. And so, yeah, what we know of these guys is a lot of information, of course, comes from the faunal assemblages that we can find at these sites. Again, at that point, we don't have any big questions if humans were cognitively and physiologically able to hunt and bring down large game. I think like the community is very much agrees that with Homo erectus leaving Africa, we have this relatively tall, actually impressively tall hominin that can apparently like conquer Eurasia, and possibly also by following herds of herbivores, right? Seasonally migrations of large herbivores. The interesting thing that researchers have looked at is the dietary ecology of these different hominins that are utilizing similar spaces, for example, within Europe. And so some of the interesting question was, and then, you know, like I already talked a little bit about like the niche differentiation between sympatric, so coexisting gorillas and chimpanzees. Well, how does it look like with two hominins, right? So in most places that we were around in Africa, for example, we were coexisting at the same time, or our ancestors were coexisting with other hominin species, which is something that we can not really imagine because Homo sapiens has been alone on this planet now for quite some time, right? Like tens of thousands of years. But in our past, there have always been some hominins around, right? Like, so we know that, for example, Homo naledi, right? An African, South African hominin was clearly around when Homo sapiens was running around already for a long time. And we just have to think about that. So similarly, it's kind of crazy to think that you have Neanderthals and modern or anatomically modern humans coexisting in Europe. And the big question is like, well, what do they do, right? Well, through genetics, we of course know that there was some interactions between the two species, right? With anyone alive, any human alive today, outside of African ancestry, actually having, you know, Denisovan and also Neanderthal DNA in our genome. But the big question was about like the diet. So how do these two coexisting, overlapping in space and time hominins, how do their diets allow for that, right? Or are they competing dietarily? And so the picture that kind of emerged over the last few decades, and I would like to claim that isotope analysis was part of the puzzle here, really looks like that Neanderthals were initially thought to like be very much like just large game hunters, like incredibly sophisticated in tracking and bringing down like gigantic mammals such as the woolly mammoth, but also woolly rhino, horses, and so on and so forth. Whereas anatomically modern humans probably, you know, also being capable in hunting large game, but also not being shy of eating small animals, right? Like so small to medium-sized mammals, or aquatic birds, and so on and so forth, right? So it's not the point that Neanderthals were not utilizing these resources at all, but it just seems that modern humans were just more versatile in what they would, you know, what resources that they would exploit. Whereas Neanderthals really seem to have a thing for the woolly mammoth for quite some time. And which makes sense, right? Like you can bring down one animal and like your family or community can actually utilize that resource for quite some long time, right? If we think that they probably had the ability to smoke meat, and then also the winters being relatively long and cold, that you could also like, you know, freeze the meat and so on and so forth. However, over the last decades and the role of plants in the diet, particularly of Neanderthals, has shifted. So there has been like some incredible work by, for example, my colleague Amanda Henry, who was at the Max Planck, I think now she's at Leiden University in the Netherlands. she did some incredible work about cooking, right? And just finding evidence of Neanderthals actually cooking plant matter, and getting a higher caloric return from actually like cooking vegetation by analyzing dental calculus. So that mineralized tartar that we have on our teeth and that would actually build up to like big chunks if we wouldn't have our dental cleanings regularly. You actually find a lot of like plant remains or also like the proteins of animals that we consume that are kind of like entrapped in there. And so Amanda Henry found like a lot of evidence for starch grains that Neanderthals were utilizing starchy plant foods in different places. Ranging from what today is the Levant, ranging all the way into Central Europe, that Neanderthals were always cooking plants. And it's a really, really incredible research there. And of course, like we know that early humans leaving Africa were probably also eating a lot of plant matter. But the focus has always been on like, well, how much meat are they eating and what kind of animals are they bringing down? Of course, we have a lot of archaeological sites where we have like these gigantic assemblages of all the fauna that was left behind by these Paleolithic hunters, no matter if they're Neanderthals or modern humans.
Does it make sense at all to talk about a paleo diet? I mean, was there, and now I want to focus particularly on Homo sapiens because I guess it's it's on our own species that people are focusing when they talk about a supposed paleo diet. I mean, were we really eating one single type of diet in the Paleolithic?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say like probably no, right? Because like within the if we think about like the Paleolithic and Ricardo, I'm not even sure like if the term paleo diet refers to the Paleolithic, right? I think it just refers to paleo in terms of the ancient diet or the original diet, right?
Yeah.
The diet we evolved with. And like if we would like break it down to like that definition is like then you have to like return the question and say like, well, when paleo, right? Are we talking about when we were hunter-gatherers? Are we talking about where we were still living up in trees and like eating ripe fruit like chimpanzees? Like how far back in time do you want to go? But my understanding what people refer to as paleo diet is referred to as some vaguely ancestral diet before we became sedentary and engaged in agriculture. And so I'm just thinking that because there's quite a lot of meat and as far as I know, also fish in that diet, right?
Yeah.
And where the emphasis is, I think, as far as I understand, the paleo diet move is to avoid carbohydrates, right? Or having like a diet that's relatively low in carbohydrates, relatively high on proteins, high in fats,
yes,
and largely avoiding carbohydrates. And so here is actually the problem that I think most paleoanthropologists and biological anthropologists that agree on, we know that starchy foods, so carbohydrate-rich foods, were probably very essential to early human evolution. And so there's incredible work that was done by, for example, Richard Wrangham and Rachel Kamudi that actually showed that the role of tubers in the diet in the early diet of hominins was probably one of the catalysts of brain growth, or like this what we call hominins getting bigger and bigger brains. So it might not have just been meat and like going out and hunting and getting like a very, very nutritious meal full of protein and fat, but it was probably more or at least equivalent individuals from the community going out and digging up tubers, for example, right? So if researchers are studying the diet of existing hunter-gatherers, no matter if you're talking about forest hunter-gatherers that are still existing in some parts of the world, for example, in the Central African rainforest, or if we're looking at like some of the last savanna hunter-gatherers, for example, the Hadza in what is today Tanzania. These people, particularly the women, spent a lot of time in searching and very successfully knowing exactly where to go to find tubers that are incredibly rich in starches and that are then processed, for example, pounded or cooked to actually like utilize the starches. Starches, are then turned into sugars, pure carbohydrates. And so that's exactly also what Amanda Henry found in all these Neanderthals in Eurasia, is they are probably eating some kind of tubers, right? Like anything that's like rich in starches. And so to get back to your question about the paleo diet, if I envision a paleo diet, yes, I probably do see some amounts of meat in there, cooked meat, right? Because in that time period, we have fire. We have like the earliest secured and undisputed evidence for fire use that dates to around like 700 or 800,000 years ago, right? We think that we used fire before that, but we just don't have solid evidence for it. But at that time, we're cooking. And we're cooking some meat, and we're probably still eating a good amount of fruit, nuts, seeds, but we're also eating a lot of tubers. And so if you would transfer that into a modern day paleo diet, you would probably eat a lot of potatoes and yam, and also other starchy foods, for example, cereals, right? Because that's also, cereals are, domesticated grasses, right? And so we can assume that early foragers were also utilizing, the seeds of wild grasses, right? And then ultimately we started domesticating them because we thought they're so good. So, yeah. The whole paleo diet, but also the paleo diet question, I think it's shifting all the time. It's very much like it's a fashion trend, right? In what to eat, because people want to eat well, if there would be a little bit more carbs in paleo diet, I think it would be more authentically paleo.
And I mean, what were the main changes to our diet that were brought about with the advent of agriculture?
Well, agriculture changed everything, right? And like just to kind of take a step back of like when I was a student, like we still called it the Neolithic Revolution, right? Which always like had like this tone to it, like that it was a very, very rapid process, and it just like some community invented it somewhere, and like boom, everything changed from one day to the other. So the idea that plants could actually be manipulated, right, and to increase yields and the reliability of finding these plants in a given place and utilize them year after year, and then actually becoming so good at it to become like sedentary, that was invented by hunter-gatherer forager communities in different parts of the world, right? It just didn't happen only in the Levant, it happened in different places in the world. That humans probably started with some of these grasses, for example, as I mentioned, right? Like we have like some of these grasses that are being domesticated, for example, in East Asia, which then later turns into rice. And then we have in the Levant, some wheat varieties that we call emmer, einkorn, and later barley, that have wild precursors that are already relatively nutritious. And then we see that people are selecting for specific traits in these plants that are favorable for not only eating them, but also harvesting and storing them, right? So for example, one trait you want to look for in a grain is that the seeds of a plant that shattered very little, so you could like pick it and bring it, transport it without losing all the seeds right away. That was probably a trait that you were going for if you wanted to, use some of those seeds and spread them out, and then have them flourish and provide food for the next season, right? So people were doing that in many different places in the world. The beautiful thing is then also we have like the proliferation of the use of pottery that, again, starts already with hunter-gatherers. We have hunter-gatherers, for example, in East Asia that are already using pottery as hunter-gatherer fishing communities, right? But the diet really changes because humans are suddenly able to spend more time in what we before in hunter-gatherer communities refer to more as like base camps, like more temporary, seasonal campsites that are moved at least like annually. You have to like go somewhere else for like, maybe the rainy season or leave somewhere for the dry season and so on and so forth. So these people are now able to stay in the same place and not only utilize the environment for obtaining foods, but also start producing foods, right? Starting to domesticate a variety of plants, not only cereals, but also legumes that we talked about earlier, right? Like we start like seeing like some, for example, beans and peas being domesticated in different places in the world. And then, of course, animals. And so part of that sedentary lifestyle is being in the same place and using the resources that you start producing. And what changes is many things. So the diet particularly gets more starchy than probably it ever has been before, because these cereals are very nutritious, very high in carbohydrates. They're easy to store, relatively speaking, particularly when you have pottery. And so people have a lot of starches in their diet. A lot of starches in your diet easily translates into sugars. And you probably know that what happens with your teeth if you have a relatively high sugar diet. You start having like some oral hygiene issues that are coming up, right? So that is something that we initially always connected with the onset of agriculture, that people get really shitty teeth, right? People have like much higher frequencies of lesions through cavities, through what we call caries, right? And so that has always been like that picture. With the onset of agriculture, your teeth are going bad. And there's other health implications, of course, living in the same place, probably also population number expanding, and we're living side by side with all these domesticated animals. So we suddenly are starting to deal with zoonotic disease, right? So it's actually like in terms of human health, I think there's like some consensus that in terms of human health, it was a little bit of a bad idea to transfer from hunter-gatherer forager lifestyle into agriculture. Also, what we see in that time period, at least like what I'm familiar with more in Eurasia, is as soon as people become sedentary, also human-human conflict starts to get bigger, right? And then, of course, like at least like in the Bronze Age, then we really have the proliferation or the evolution of like social dominance hierarchies within human communities. And so on and so forth. So whereas we often think of hunter-gatherer societies being more egalitarian, right? And resources being shared among group members. But yeah, so I think like really the idea is that the onset of agriculture has a toll on particularly the dental health of humans. There's some evidence from archaeological sites of hunter-gatherer populations that are predating agriculture that actually suggests that that might be an oversimplification of the picture. So we have some hunter-gatherer communities that are, for example, heavily dependent rely on nuts, for example, acorns, right? And acorns are really, really incredible food resource if you know how to actually process them to make them palatable. But once you reach that, then you have a high caloric return, easy to collect food resource, but it's high in starch, hence it's high in sugar. And so we see some hunter-gatherer populations that eat a lot of acorns, and they also have dental problems, just like early agricultural societies do.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, generally speaking, at least when we're talking about the early farmers, their diets were poorer than the diets of hunter-gatherers, right?
I would not say that their diets were poor. Obviously, they were doing pretty well. It was a lifestyle that was becoming very successful and expanded relatively rapidly. And so that said, like, I think there's an argument to be made that the agricultural lifestyle overpowered hunter-gatherer communities where they actually like expanded into, right? We see hunter-gatherer populations either disappearing or assimilating this lifestyle, right? So there must be some success in that story, probably also connected with the ability to produce a higher number of offspring, right? We have like a population expansion in that time period. So I wouldn't really say that it was like a negative outcome for these people. It was highly successful. The one thing is that I kind of like my personal view, at least, is that life was harder as a farmer, right? So we have many studies that show that hunter-gatherers can actually acquire in a very sustainable way enough resources to meet their daily energetic, caloric requirements by just spending a few hours out in the bush or in the forest and utilizing wild plants, mushrooms, wild animals, and spending a lot of time like in communal and social activities after that. With agriculture, we actually have societies that have to work their butts off to actually get enough, like the number of hours of labor expand, right? And so, but then those people are also like able to produce more offspring, right? Probably because of the invention of like food storage and all these things. So I'm a person, like I would rather prefer working less and spending more time doing the things I love. But it is a technology like using domesticated animals and domesticated plants that apparently has been incredibly successful. Otherwise, we wouldn't be where we are right now.
Right, but wasn't it the case that when it comes to their health, their nutrition in general wasn't as good as the nutrition of hunter-gatherers, because at least the early farmers were shorter in stature, or is that outdated information?
Well, I'm actually like not sure what like the current discourse is regarding that. I don't know if like the picture is very much like more about like later in like the medieval period that like these farming communities are getting like incredibly short and like are like always like struck by like some incredible pandemic diseases and famines and so on and so forth. When I'm thinking about like early hunter-gatherers, like I'm really thinking about some of these incredible archaeological sites, for example, in Anatolia, where we have people that are still doing like small scale hunting, but they are also domesticating wild animals, and they have a range of domesticated plants to their disposal. So they're like transitioning very much into a more sedentary lifestyle, but they still have like a lot of wild resources that they can utilize, right? So we see that in a lot of different places in the world that hunter-gatherers like give up that lifestyle to join probably like more sedentary agricultural societies. possibly even in these scenarios where, big game has moved on, and these farmers are sitting there and are there like utilizing the resources that they have gathered over the last 9 months, and they're doing just fine, right? And if needed, they can slaughter a goat or a sheep. And so I don't think that picture of like earlier farmers being like completely deprived and sick and tiny statured humans is up to date anymore.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I'm really getting mindful of your time. We are reaching our time limit here. So perhaps if you agree, we could have somewhere in the near future another conversation just to wrap up this bit about human diet, particularly now in the Neolithic, and then also to talk about your more recent work on the transatlantic slave trade. So just before we go, where can people find your work on the internet?
Oh, yeah. So I am actually like a person who's not using social media for my science communication at all. I have a website where you can find me. That is www.pema-lab.com. So PEMA -lab. .com, and I try to keep that updated with all my recent news coming out, any kind of media coverage or publications, and I also like really try to highlight the work of my incredible team of undergraduate students and my previous postdocs and graduate students on that website. So yeah, please guys check that out. And you can also like find some more information about my work on the transatlantic slave trade. That's kind of like the thing that I'm working on primarily now, besides my work on the dietary ecology of African great apes. So I'm like really doing weird twofold research, right? I'm a primatologist and an archaeological scientist at the same time. A lot of people find that quite confusing, but I find it very, very stimulating. So yeah, and Ricardo, I'd love to have another conversation with you about my work in more historical archaeology, actually, right? When I never thought that I would ever get into, particularly like I'm working on a very, very prominent site in Portugal called Vale da Gafaria in Lagos, which is the only site that we know of in entire Europe where enslaved Africans have been found in a mass burial. And so I'd love to talk about that with you at another occasion.
Okay, great. So very much looking forward to that. And thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show today. It's been really fun to talk with you.
All right. Thanks for the invitation. I really enjoyed it too.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Ergo Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Mikkel Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Fortiago Nunes, Fergal Kossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Labyrinth, João Linhares, Stantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Alman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Lowacki, Georgios Theophanes, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry Dealey Jr., Old Erringbone, Asteri, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismail Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht. A special thanks to my producers, Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugni, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Alnick Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.